Give me a sec. Awesome, we are live. So let us start with our practice tonight. So here I have, I'm gonna share my screen with you. And we are going to use this material that I have here already prepared for you. And we are going to be using this as a matter of practice. Well, so as you know, in the speaking section task number 4, the only material you're going to receive from ETS is going to be a lecture. And that lecture is going to last for approximately 2 minutes. And once you finalize listening to that, you have to prepare a response in 20 seconds. You are very well informed that the response you have to prepare is simply a summary of the lecture you have listened to. So well, let us go and practice. And here I have the first lecture for all of you. Okay. So let's go. I'm going to reproduce this lecture. So please take your piece of paper, take your pencils. As you listen, remember to take your notes because that is going to be the material you're going to use to prepare the response afterwards, okay? So for those of you who are just joining, we're about to practice for the 4th task of the speaking section. We're about to reproduce the first lecture. Grab your piece of paper and your pencils, and as you listen, take your notes, okay? Let us start. Here you have the first lecture of tonight's practice.
All right. Now that you all have microscopes at your tables, I want to explain how they work and how to use them. First of all, you should know that they are compound microscopes, so they can magnify objects up to 1,000 times their size. These microscopes have 2 systems, an illuminating system and an imaging system. You'll see that the illuminating system has a light source built in, and you can control it by adjusting the lever on the side. Why is this important? Well, the specimen must be pretty thin, or let's say transparent enough to let light pass through it. So the light source controls the amount of light that passes through the specimen. Okay, the other system provides magnification. Use this lever to switch powers. So when you switch to a higher power, you see a larger image. And when you switch to a lower power, you see a smaller image. But I should remind you that the field of view is smaller at a higher power. In other words, at a higher magnification, you see a larger image of a smaller area. Okay, so what about the focus? Well, these microscopes are parfocal, and that means you usually don't have to refocus when you switch to a higher or lower power of magnification. But there are 2 adjustment knobs, the larger one for coarse adjustment and the smaller one for fine adjustment, just in case.
Using the main points and examples from the talk, describe the 2 major systems of the laboratory microscope, and then explain how to use it.
Okay, that's it. Well, we have listened then to this lecture on microscopes, and now it's time for you to prepare the summary, okay? So I'm going to go and display here my chronometer. And looking at my screen, please, all of you, okay, all of you, start preparing your summary for the question now. Okay, great. Well, let us start then. And in this case, let us start with Lucia, okay? So Lucia, you're going to help me out with this first response. So please, you can start responding to the question now.
Okay. In this lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of microscope and the work and uses that it has. And we can see that it was divided in 2 main points, illuminated and magnification. The first lecture's point and illustration is about the illumination that talks about the light, the service, and the level, and how the light passes throughout. And the second lecture point is about the switch power and magnification that it has in the microscope. And in the third lecture point, we can see that the part of the focus has the larger and the small, and it depends about the adjustment and the adjustment that can have for every object. So to conclude, that is the part and the magnified object of this tool.
All right, great. Very good. Thank you very much, Lucia. All right, so let us continue with Karen. Please, here, Karen. You're going to be the next one. So please start. Yes?
Sorry, I came late to the classes, so I couldn't listen all the audio.
All right. Okay, it's fine, dear Karen. Don't worry. So you're going to help us in the next round, okay?
Thank you, teacher.
All right, my pleasure. Great. Let's go then with well, let's go with Lenny then. So please, here, Lenny, you're going to follow up. So you can start responding to the question now.
In the reading passage, we've been immersed into the topic of microscopes and how to use them. Likewise, in the listening passage, they talk about the two main uses about the illuminating that you can, where you can control the side about the transparent, or the light can pass into the transparent, and about the magnification, where you can larger or smaller an image. Also talk about the higher and smaller uses in the microscope when you don't refocus and when you adjustment very well the microscope. So it's an instrument that allows to observe short entities.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Lenny. Fantastic. Let's move on to Daniela Crespo. Please, dear Daniela. You're going to follow up. So please start delivering your response now.
This lecture introduces us how a microscope works and how to use it. First, we've been told that this microscope can magnify an image over 1,000 times, sorry. Then we know that there are two systems. The first one is the illumination systems. And this one provides light to the image and allows, for example, to avoid the transparency of a specimen. Then we have the magnification system, which allows to have a larger or lower image. And it has two adjustments, a higher and a lower one. And the higher one, for example, allows us to have a higher image than it is.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Daniela. Very good. Let us continue with Maya. Please, dear Maya. We go next. So please start responding to the question now.
In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of how microscope works. First lecture point is about illuminating, that it says that it has a light source, so the light passes through the specimen. And second lecture's point is about magnification. It says, like, for example, you see a larger image shorter, and that it has two adjustments that helps see higher and lower parts of the specimen. That's it.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Maya. Very good. All right, let us go with Jasmine. Jasmine, please. You go next, and you can start responding to the question now.
Okay, teacher. In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of how microscopes works and uses. And the means mentions that this acquirement has two important systems, and the first is illuminate system, which be charged to provide light to the object you want to observe. And the other is magnification system, which is be charged to provide the higher image or larger. That's all.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. There you are. And now, is there anybody that has not responded to the question, dear students? Somebody I'm forgetting?
Me, teacher.
All right, great. So
Hello?
go ahead. Yes, I can listen to you.
Yeah.
All right,
Okay.
fantastic, Karen.
Okay.
So please, you can start now.
In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of microscope and how to use them. They have two systems, illuminating and magnification. First one, show this source inside, and for example, you can see the transparent of the species. The next one is magnification. You can see the larger or smaller images, depends of the magnification of the power. The next one is that you have two adjustment to see the different objects, and you can adjust the images. Okay.
Right. Beautiful. Thank you very much, Karen. Very good. All right, guys. Well, we have finalized then with this first round. So let me give you some feedback. Generally, I have to say, I am very much impressed. All of you did a fantastic job. I think that your responses were excellent, honestly, very conspicuous. And well, let us just go into a more deeper examination. So talking about Lucia then, so you notice Lucia was fantastic. I don't have any commentary. It was great. And I like the fact that you say, right, like first lectures point. It's fine. You can say that. Of course, it is not necessary, right? Because notice that you could simply say firstly or to start with. But it's fine when you say first lectures points and illustration when you continue, right? Because you are respecting the structure and you're also mentioning it, right? Making reference to it. But it is, of course, up to you. Very good. Then Lenny as well, great response. You summarized the entire lecture. Now, maybe you were using, I think, the last structure or template we used in the third task, right, of the speaking section. I think that you were not present yesterday, right? But the thing is that it is actually the same, but the way you used it was great because you noticed, right, how in this case, we don't have a reading passage. So we're just summarizing the entire lecture, okay? So I'm gonna anyways show it to everybody so that you can just have another glance to it. Is this a structure, right, that we presented yesterday? But it's actually very similar, as I say, to the third one. It's almost identical, I would say. So here we have it, okay, for everybody. So the structure we discussed yesterday, right? An introductory phrase. In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of, and here you say, right, in this case, you would have said microscopes, right? And then you would say, firstly, the professor said, microscopes contain two different systems. First of all, magnification, and secondly, illumination, right? And then you will continue, of course, making a very detailed and scrupulous summary of the first reading passage, excuse me, of the first of the first points made in the passage. In this case, the listening, And then you would talk about the second point as well. In this case was the illumination system. And you would detail, as I say, both of those points by mentioning some examples and illustrations that professors normally express. In this case, there were no many illustrations because the topic, of course, didn't allow them to be present. Anyways, it was great, I think. Okay, it was fantastic. Great, Lenny, very good. So then, what about Daniela? So Daniela, I think you did great. Now here, notice that I think your response is excellent. You have a very natural manner to speak English. Now the thing here, maybe as a recommendation, will be to speak a little bit faster, because I noticed that it's not that your response is deficiently organized or something. It's not the case. It's that maybe you're speaking too slowly, and given that's the case, you're not able to include everything you would like to say in their response, right? So try to speak a little bit faster. It's okay as well to boost our speaking, at least in its velocity, right? So very good. Apart from that, great response. Maya too, nothing to say, fantastic response. The same for Jasmine, excellent, very good response. And about Karen Archiaga, fantastic as well, very good. The only thing here that I would comment on would be the pronunciation of the word images, right? When you pronounce that word images, imágenes, right? You do it that way, like images, as if you were saying like this. I'm gonna write it for you, like images, that way. Okay, something like that in Spanish, right? That's how you would pronounce it, images. But apart from that, great, excellent response. Awesome, let's go to another one. We have a bunch of them to practice together. So let's go to the lecture number 2, okay? So get prepared. We're actually going to use this one on the simulator. Okay, let me get into. All right. Awesome, let's go. So here we have the second lecture. As you know, take your notes and listen very carefully.
Now, listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
Let's talk about 2 kinds of biological selection. 2 different ways that traits are selected in a species of animal as it breeds and reproduces. First, there's natural selection. Here, living things develop features that help them survive in a certain kind of climate, escape from a certain kind of predator, that sort of thing. In contrast, we have artificial selection. Artificial selection happens outside of what we'd call nature. It happens when people deliberately breed living things for their own use. Now, it's true that natural selection and artificial selection both give a living thing the traits it needs to reproduce and survive. But these 2 types of biological selection also have very different effects, obviously. Maybe one of the easiest places to see this difference is with wolves and dogs. Let's start with wolves. So, what's a wolf's job? It's to survive in the wild and get enough to eat, right? So certain qualities are naturally selected. Wolves need keen senses so they can detect prey. They need to be fast, strong, and aggressive to catch their prey, and to survive even in the harshest weather. Wolves that are born with these qualities live longer and pass the qualities on to their pups. That's natural selection. But a dog's job, its role in its environment, is a little different. Dogs don't need to survive in the wild. They need human protection. So to survive, a breed of dog needs to have traits that humans want. Take the golden retriever. People bred a dog big enough to be a good hunter, but not so big that it was hard to control. And it had to be obedient, unlike a wolf, right? A golden retriever has to be, well, friendly in order to be well-liked enough that we humans decide to breed it, so we can get similarly friendly puppies, more pets.
Using points and examples from the talk, explain the 2 types of biological selection.
Great. Well, that's our second lecture, and you know what to do. Same procedure, 20 seconds to prepare your responses, okay? So all of you start doing so now. Beautiful. So let's go. Let's start with this new round, okay? So let us start in this opportunity with Karen Rojas, okay? So Karen Rojas, you go first, all right? So please, you can start responding to the question now.
Okay, in this lecture, we've been present to the fascinating topic of biological selection. The teacher talks about two selection. The first one is the natural selection, and the second one is the artificial selection. The first one is when the nature makes the selection in the natural world. And in the second one, the artificial selection is when the human interview in this selection. So then he gives them examples. And the first one is with a wolf, and he talk about that with this animal, we have a natural selection. They need to be fast, strong to live in the wild world. And the second example is a dog. She needs the human protection, so it's artificial selection.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Karen. Very good. Let us move on to Lucia, please. Dear Lucia, you go next. So please, you can start responding to the question now.
Okay. In this lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of biological selection. And it was divided in two main points. The first was about natural selection, that the factor that depends is the climate and the predator. And the second is artificial selection. Both of these types of selections depends on the reproduce and survey of the human beings. To illustrate, the first point is about the wolf. That they say that, for example, the main point for the wolf is to survive in the wild, in natural areas, and to be every time more fast and more strong. And for example, in the second illustration that they give is about the dog and with the human protection related with the golden retriever behavior.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucia. Fantastic. Let's continue with Karen Artiaga in this case, all right? So please, you're Karen. You can start responding to the question now.
In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of biological selection. There are two types. The first one is natural selection. In this case, animals develop abilities to survive in the natural way. For example, the wolf has to be strong to detect their prey and survive in the wild. That is an example of natural selection. In the other way would be the artificial selection. For example, dogs. They need the protection human. They have to be obedient and no big hunter but they need the human protection.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. Fantastic. Let's continue with Maya. Please, you're Maya. You go next, and you can start responding now.
In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of true biological selection. First lecture point and illustration is about natural selection, like wolves. They live in a wild environment, and they are fast, strong, and aggressive. For example, they live longer and they survive in a wild environment. Second lecture point and illustration is about dogs, like golden retriever. They are friendly and they need humans that they take care of them so they can survive.
Great. Thank you very much, Maya. Very good. All right, let's move on to Jasmine. Please, here, Jasmine, you go next. And you can start responding to the question, yes, no.
Well, in this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of biological selection, and the professor says that there are two selections, what are natural selection and artificial selection. In the first case, for example, wolves, they are animals that need to hunt in order to eat, and in the second case, there are dogs which need to the human protection in order to survive, we can say. So in the first case, the animal doesn't have options, and in the other, they have an option.
Awesome. Thank you very much, dear Jasmine. Very good. Let's continue with Lenny. Please, Lenny, you go next, and you can start responding now.
In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of biological selection. They talk about natural selection. This happens when an animal can adapt and survive in wild nature, like predators, and artificial selection that is imposed usually by humans. The professor talked about the different effects that both of them have. For example, the wolves that are wild but live longer, and on the other hand, talk about dogs that they don't need to survive because they have human protection. And for example, the golden retrievers, that they are a hunter, but they don't live in wild. They are obedient and friendly like puppies.
Magnificent. Thank you very much, Lenny. And let us finalize this round with Daniela, okay? So please, dear Daniela, you can start responding now.
In this lecture, we've been presented to the topic of biological selection, which is divided into types. First of all, we have the natural selection, which is the survival in a specific climate to predators and having to hunt, for example. And then we have the artificial selection, which is having to survive in an environment which is not natural for the species. Both of them are aimed to allow the reproduction and survival of any kind of species. We have the example of wolves for natural selection. They have to survive in the wild and aggressive climates, so they have to be fast and have other physiological features. And then we have the dogs who just depend on human protection, so they have to adapt to what the humans want of them, for example, to be friendly.
Great. Thank you very much, dear Daniela. Very good. All right, guys, I think nobody's lacking, right? Yes. Well, awesome. So let me comment a little bit on your responses, okay? So talking about Karen, I think it was great, dear Karen. It was a fantastic response. Here, the only observation I may suggest would be with regard to how you pronounce intervenes, right? When you said a human may intervene or a human intervenes in artificial selection, right? So intervene or intervening, right? Intervenir is pronounced that way, like intervenes, right? But apart from that, fantastic response. The same for all of you guys, Lucia, Karen, Maya, Jasmine, Lenny, Daniela. Don't have any observation with regard to the structure or to the pronunciation. I think that your responses were very much efficient, and with regard to the time, of course, I mean, and they demonstrated a lot of proficiency as well in this language, grammar, syntax. I think it was fantastic. I just have to congratulate you. Let's move on. We have more practices. Great. Let's go to another one. Here we have a third lecture to practice together. So let's see what this one is all about, okay? All right, here we have the third one. Listen carefully.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
In the 8th century BCE, a legendary author named Homer wrote 2 epic poems. You probably know them already, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're fascinating poems, really, partly because they give us such a clear window to the culture of the time. But what culture or what period of Greek history was Homer describing? His own era or an earlier one? It's an interesting question, but it's very likely there's no real answer. You see, Homer was working in the oral tradition. Before he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey down, poems were told and retold by generations of storytellers. Each generation added details to the poems, so it's likely that these poems are actually this. They're an interesting mixture of historical details about a bunch of different time periods. So let me give you a couple of examples. Here's one. Homer describes helmets made out of boar tusks. Well, just these kinds of helmets have actually been discovered in sites dating back to the 2nd millennium BCE in Greece. They weren't used in later time periods. That's a pretty clear indication, right? So clearly Homer's poems preserved some authentic details about the distant past, and some would argue that's the era Homer intended to write about. But then we take a look at another detail and it's a bit more nebulous. Homer describes chariots, horse-drawn wagons carrying warriors into battle. He describes them as simply carrying troops on and off the battlefield. That might be how chariots were used in Homer's time, sure, but in earlier history, the time when those helmets might have been used, say, they were used in battles themselves. The chariots, that is. So this is a good example of Homer adding details from his own world into the poems.
Using points and examples from the talk, explain why the professor thinks there is no real answer to the question of what period of history Homer described.
Great, there we are. So, time for you to prepare those responses, dear students. So here you have your 20 seconds for doing so. Start now. I see that Daniela has a question. Yes, Daniela?
Yes, teacher, I have a problem with my internet and I haven't been able to listen very well.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, well, let's listen then once again. I think that's...
Thank you, teacher.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I think that everybody would like to listen anyways, once again to this lecture, okay? So just for this time, we're going to listen one more time. So if the rest of you manage to understand, just start preparing your summary, but let us listen to this once again, okay? Let's go.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
In the 8th century BCE, a legendary author named Homer wrote 2 epic poems. You probably know them already, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're fascinating poems, really, partly because they give us such a clear window to the culture of the time. But what culture or what period of Greek history was Homer describing? His own era or an earlier one? It's an interesting question, but it's very likely there's no real answer. You see, Homer was working in the oral tradition. Before he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey down, poems were told and retold by generations of storytellers. Each generation added details to the poems, so it's likely that these poems are actually this. They're an interesting mixture of historical details about a bunch of different time periods. So let me give you a couple of examples. Here's one. Homer describes helmets made out of boar tusks. Well, just these kinds of helmets have actually been discovered in sites dating back to the 2nd millennium BCE in Greece. They weren't used in later time periods. That's a pretty clear indication, right? So clearly Homer's poems preserved some authentic details about the distant past, and some would argue that's the era Homer intended to write about. But then we take a look at another detail and it's a bit more nebulous. Homer describes chariots, horse-drawn wagons carrying warriors into battle. He describes them as simply carrying troops on and off the battlefield. That might be how chariots were used in Homer's time, sure, but in earlier history, The time when those helmets might have been used, say, they were used in battles themselves. The chariots, that is. So, this is a good example of Homer adding details from his own world into the poems.
Using points and examples from the talk, explain why the professor thinks there is no real answer to the question of what period of history Homer described.
Very good. Fantastic, guys. So let us start with these round of responses. And in this case, our dear Karen Artiaga is going to be the first one to respond, okay? So please, dear Karen, you can start responding to the question now.
In this lecture, we presented the fascinating topic of Homer's and his poems. He wrote different famous poems like the Iliad and Odyssey in the 8th century. But the interesting mixture of historical details, but in a bunch of different periods. It's a clear window of the culture of the time. In this case, we can see the preserved distant past. For example, he explained about the chariots that they carrying on the battlefield, and in that time, we can see that they use only in the battle themselves. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. Very good. Let us continue then with our dear Lenny. So please, Lenny, go ahead responding to the question now.
In this lecture, we've been presented the fascinating topic of Homer and his main poems that are Iliad and Odyssey that describes the culture of the time. They was in the period Greek history, and it's an oral tradition for generations in different time periods. Homer used some authentic details of the period, like battles themselves, and try to describe simple characters and chariots. And it was mainly in the second millennium before Christ. His poems was the main of the culture.
All right. Thank you very much, Lenny. Very good. Let's move on to Daniela Crespo. Please, Daniela, you can start responding to the question now.
In this lecture, we've been presented to the topic of the poems written by Homer, and more specific, the Iliad. The professor asks himself what culture and era is this history talking about? But it's a difficult question to answer because the poems have been transmitted orally from generation to generation, and each one has added some details. And for example, Homer refers to helmets, but these have just been discovered later in Greece.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniela. There you are. Let us move on to Maya. Please, Maya, you can start responding now.
In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of literature. First lecture point and illustration is about Homer and how he makes historical details and different time periods. Second lecture point and illustration is about Homer, how he describes different details of distant past, and he talks about carrots and the time of use, and he adds his own words to the details, and it's a mix of earlier and earlier Homer and his own details, his own items. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much, Maya. Very good. Let us continue with Jasmine. So please, here, Jasmine, you can start responding now.
In this lecture, we've been presented to the topic of Homer's poems. It mentions the Odyssey and Iliad. Homer works in the oral tradition because these poems or stories they used to tell in oral form to generate and describe myths, and also in his poems we found details of the history, but they don't have certain order. That's all.
Okay, thank you very much, Jasmine. Let us continue with Lucia. Please, Lucia, you go next, and you can start now.
Okay. In this lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of the exactly period of history that described in the Iliad or Odyssey from Homer. The first point that the professor mentioned, it's about that in the Iliad, for example, it starts or it mentioned about culture, about Greek history, but it's not a specific time of period, because the main reason could be that this mixture of different points of view and times is the retail or a typical or traditional activity. And the second point that they mention is the chariot warrior battlefield. That is the battle themselves, and it's just a shortly history. To summarize, I think that the professor mentioned that all the Iliad comes from one word and not a specific time.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucia. And let us finalize with Karen Rojas. Okay, so please, Karen, you can start now.
In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of periods of time of a story about Homer poems. The teacher describes some examples about the poems that Homer wrote, and also give a question that is the exact period of time of the rights of Homer. But the answer is that it's not a real answer. It's a mixture of historical details, and he gives two examples. The first one is Homest, that happened in the second millennium, and this gave authentic details about the past. The second one is the tourist in the war. So this developed in the battlefield.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. Awesome, guys. Well, so great. I think that all of you were great once again. Little commentaries on each of you. Karen Artiaga, very good. The only word right, details, when you pronounce that word details. Apart from that, excellent. Lenny, very good, no commentaries. Lenny as well, no commentaries. Maya, the same case, no commentaries, just been two, very good. Lucy as well, very good. And Karen as well, Rojas, very good. The only little word, carrots, right? When you talked about carros, carrots. These mobiles that were utilized centuries or millennia ago, and that were guided or engined by horses instead of electrical or mechanical enzymes, right? But yeah, karyotes, that's how you pronounce it. Apart from that, great, very good. All right, guys, let's go with one last lecture before you go, so you can have a complete practice, okay? So let's go. Here we have another lecture, and please serve yourself of this new lecture on a scientific topic.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a sociology class.
Let's consider the way sociologists use the terms culture and society. A society is a distinct group of people. A sociologist would say that people in a society are defined by their social interactions and the culture they share. Meanwhile, culture itself can be defined as that society's shared knowledge, beliefs, and expectations. Often people think of a society as something really, well, big. And sure, that's true. An entire nation, for example, will generally have some common thread of culture that defines it. The most obvious example is that citizens of one region generally speak a common language. But think about behavioral standards too. Like, what's considered polite or impolite? Whereas in one country you might be expected to take off your shoes as the guest in another's home. In other countries that might be considered strange. Cultural traits like that can extend over enormous populations. But a society can also be much smaller, much simpler. Take this class. Aren't we a society? We have social interactions with each other every week. And I think it's fair to say we have a culture of a sort too. Think back to what happened on the second day of class. Do you all remember? I'd missed my train and didn't have any way to let you all know that I'd be late. But in contrast to other classes, where students might have just headed home 15 minutes after the planned start time, each and every one of you waited the full 30 minutes it took me to arrive. That kind of set expectations, right? It laid the foundation for a culture of patience, something I think is still true of this particular group, this little society.
Using points and examples.
Very good. So please, all of you, dear students, prepare your responses for this new question now. All right, there you are. Thank you very much, guys. And now let's start in this case with Lucia. Please, there, Lucia, you can start responding to this question now.
In this lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of the difference between the culture and society. And the first point mentioned about the main characters of culture that says it's important, it's a concept that means a common language, a behavior standard, and most of the citizens has these same topics in the same level. But this for culture. But for example, for society, it implies more aspects to be considered. Like a society could be like a small group that could have a different social interaction with different behaviors, with different cultural keywords. And the illustration was about the second day of the class, that the actions were really different according to society and culture.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucia. Let us continue with Karen Rojas. So please, Karen Rojas, you can start responding to the question now.
Okay. In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of society and culture. So the professor talked about that in a culture, well, we have a common language, we have different, in this case, issues or behaviors that are common when we talk about the culture. But in the other hand, the society, it's like a small group, but the interaction is that that the group could be a different people, and he gives an example about his class and how he miss his train and get late to his class, and how these different groups react to this problem.
Great, thank you very much. Let us continue with Daniela. Please, Daniela, go ahead responding now.
In this topic, we've been presented to the topic of culture and society. First of all, the professor talks about society. He defines it like a group of people where there is social interaction, and there is a culture which is shared, and the group share also beliefs and expectations. Then a culture is defined as a group of citizens of a region, for example, and they have one language. Sorry. Finally, he describes the class as a society.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Let us continue with Maya. So Maya, please start responding to the question now.
In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of sociology and culture. First lecture point in the illustration is about a big group of people and how they share knowledge, beliefs, and expectation, and they have things in common. Second lecture point is about smaller groups like class and how they have social interaction and they have its own culture. For example, the professor talked about how he was late to the class and how that created culture of patience when he's late and the students don't know when he's going to go to the class.
Great, thank you very much. Let us move on with Jasmine. Please, Jasmine, you go next. And you can start responding now.
Well, in this lecture, we've been presented to the interesting topic of society and culture. And the professor defines society as a group of people where the interaction is necessary. And this group has beliefs, traditions, and cultures. And the cultures, it's different according to the society, different societies, because different cultures have different behavior rules. In some societies, some behavior is bad, and others is considered good. In some cases, we make mistakes in order to treat in bad way in other people.
All right. Thank you very much. Let us continue with Karen Arteaga. So please, Karen, you can start this question now.
In this lecture, we'll be presented to the fascinating topic of the difference between culture and society. A society is a distinct type of people. We define it by social interaction, culture, behavior, culture that share knowledge, beliefs, and expectation. In the other side, a culture is a group that share a common language and traditions that consider polite, For example, leave your shoes before enter to a house is polite in some cultures, but in others no. A society, like an example, the teacher said that it can be small, simply like the class, where they have a social interaction. For example, he explained that the second day when the teacher was late, other students wait 30 minutes to the teacher. So they had different reactions.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. And let us finalize this round with Lenny. Okay. So please, Lenny, start responding now.
In this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of sociology. The professor talks about the culture in society, and culture is composed by society knowledge, beliefs, values, and expectations, and the society distinguished group of people who have interactions. About the culture, it's represented by the general language that makes effective social interactions, so they both are combined. And in enormous populations, for example, the behavior, it could be polite or impolite, but in smaller groups, it's more simple, the social interaction. For example, the professor said about the class that they had social interactions every week. And for example, the second day, the teacher missed the train, so the students have different reactions about this event.
Great, thank you very much. Well, guys, then we are finalizing this class with our response. And I think that all of you were great. Well, I think that all of you are able to perceive that by yourselves, that you have been improving very much throughout the class. Your responses have been exponentially improving. And I think that, well, we have done an incredible job tonight. All right, so we're gonna finalize here, but before you go, please help me with your kind responses to our traditional poll. And I tell you tomorrow, we're going to start with the writing section, and we're going to be discussing the theoretical aspects of the first task of the writing section. That, as you're going to notice tomorrow, is divided into several parts. So please don't miss tomorrow's class. It's going to be very important so that we can, of course, practice that carefully this Friday when our practice time comes. Okay, so please don't miss tomorrow's class. It's going to be very essential for you to know how to perform that part. And don't worry about your list tonight. I have already taken notice of all of you. So I see you tomorrow, okay? To finalize, well, to start, sorry, with the writing section. Okay, so have a wonderful night and see you tomorrow to all of you.
Bye, teacher.
Bye, teacher.
Thank you.